Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch of Believe. We are so excited to have you all with us this afternoon as we share some of the important information and the launch of our new Believe document, which we hope will just share a plethora of resources that you all will find helpful. So we'll begin today our agenda for about our 40 minutes or so together this afternoon. We'll ground some context in our goals and priorities of the Department of Education. We'll also take a dive into the Believe Early Childhood Planning Guide. We'll talk about some funding opportunities, the framework overview, and we'll close with the timeline and support. And we'll end hopefully with any questions that you all have. If you have questions throughout the presentation though, we invite you to add them in the chat. And I'm realizing I did not introduce myself. I am Dr. Jenna Chasson, the Assistant Superintendent for the Office of Teaching and Learning here at the Department of Education. So happy to be on with you all this afternoon. And I have some other folks from our Early Childhood Department joining us as well and helping to present this afternoon. And so this slide shows our belief statements. As a department, we thought it was really important that we identify. We've said for quite a few years now that Louisiana believes, and we thought that it was important to identify what are the things that we believe. And in January, we released the Believe to Achieve Educational Priorities, which serves as a department's roadmap to improving outcomes for all Louisiana children. We are driven by a vision and a mission centered on getting the best outcomes for all children who call Louisiana home. It is our vision that every child can reach their potential no matter where they're from, how much money their family makes, or where they live. We're going to get there by staying true to our mission, giving all students the opportunities and tools they deserve so they are prepared to graduate high school ready for a career or college. These 8 belief statements anchor our vision and mission, representing what we believe as a state. Believe to Achieve includes Louisiana's 6 critical goals that you see here on the left and the new priorities here on the right that will direct our efforts to support systems as we work together to achieve our critical goals. Our vision for Louisiana students is ambitious and attainable. Together, these 6 critical goals outline a student's successful progression from birth through graduation. Together with our educators, leaders, community members, and families, it is our responsibility to make sure every student enters kindergarten ready, exits 3rd grade reading on level and ready for the 4th grade, exits 8th grade ready for success in high school, and graduates on time with a college credit or career credential and eligible for Louisiana scholarship. Each priority includes focus areas with key actions and initiatives. On April 15, 2020, Governor John Bel Edwards signed a proclamation closing K-12 public schools in Louisiana to students until the end of the school year, with students getting their education via remote learning in an effort to fight the spread of COVID-19. Since Louisiana school facilities first closed in response to the pandemic, school systems and the department prioritize the safety of students and staff. In anticipation of school facility closure or modified operations, the department focused on supporting school systems with preparing for a strong start, developing comprehensive plans to ensure all students had access to continuous quality teaching and learning, whether virtual, in-person, or hybrid. Now, 1 year later, we are working with systems and with local agencies to create comprehensive plans that prioritizes safety with additional efforts focused on getting back to in-person teaching and learning safely, assessing and addressing academic needs, and accelerating learning. I will next hand it over to our Deputy Assistant Superintendent of Early Childhood Strategy, Taylor Dunn, who will walk us through the components of Believe.
Great, thank you so much, Jenna, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. So for the first 40 or so minutes of this presentation today, we are going to focus on Believe, which is the early childhood component of this planning framework that is being released today. And then we will turn it over to our colleagues to talk you through Achieve, which is the pre-K through 12th grade planning guide. So just a quick overview, and some of this was covered in what Jenna just described, but we are releasing this planning guide for early childhood community networks with the knowledge that new funds are available under CRSA and ARPA, the two most recent stimulus funding packages. And we know that because there is this new funding, we need to release opportunities for community networks to apply for funding and priorities and planning guidance so that community networks can begin planning for how they will spend this funding. And I will also add that the Believe framework, which we'll talk about today, is aligned to the priorities and goals that are outlined in Believe to Achieve, Louisiana's educational priorities. So it likely goes without saying that all the folks on the call today know that COVID-19 has significantly impacted our schools as well as our child care centers. And in particular, the financial impacts on childcare have been extremely detrimental. So I want to bring to your attention that actually today, a new report was released by the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children that found that from March of 2020 to January of 2021, the childcare sector experienced an estimated $245 million loss of revenue, which nearly amounts to $200,000 per center. So we recognize that without immediate stabilization and ongoing funding to support that stabilization, childcare providers are at risk of closing their doors permanently, which would be devastating to children, families, and our economy as a whole. Additionally, COVID-19 has had impacts on pre-K fairly significantly and on pre-K enrollment. So we've looked at some data from October of 2020 compared to previous years, and we've found that the statewide pre-K enrollment has dropped fairly notably. So you see here the drop in enrollment across the board. So total across the state, the pre-K enrollment from October 2019 to October 2020 dropped by 17%. And then within each of these categories, you can see how that impacts particular subgroups of students. So economically disadvantaged students, there was even larger drop in enrollment, 19% lower than the previous year. Black students, there was a 25% drop in enrollment from October 2019 to October 2020. And then urban students, also larger than the state average, 18% drop from October 2019 to October 2020. So I think it's difficult to know exactly how these drops in enrollment are going to impact students that will be entering school for the first time in this coming school year. But we do feel pretty confident that school systems and early childhood community networks should begin planning now for how they plan to support families and children who will be transitioning to school for the first time potentially in the next few months. So with those two biggest focus areas in mind, sort of thinking about childcare and the needs of the childcare field and of families, and thinking about the interruptions in learning that children and families experienced in the last year, we've arranged our planning framework around these four planning categories. So really this planning framework is outlined to ensure that community networks have funding opportunities, resources, and guidance to carry out these four things and ensure these four things are true. First is that childcare is stabilized immediately with a focus on both childcare providers and the early childhood workforce. Second, that communities increase access to opportunities for high quality early childhood education this year. So that includes pre-K and birth through 3-year-old child care. 3, teachers are prepared to lead classrooms and provide high quality interactions for all children every day, sort of irrespective of the challenges brought about by COVID-19. And 4, that young children who experience disruptions in learning this year are given opportunities to prepare for school. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding opportunities that are contained in the Believe planning framework. So early childhood funding is a little complicated. It's a little bit less straightforward in some ways than K-12 school system funding. So the early childhood funding does not come to community networks in formula funding like ESSER. So it's really important that we walk through what the different entities are that are eligible for funding and what those opportunities are. I will say this planning framework is really designed for early childhood community networks in their planning efforts. So calling out here 2 specific funding opportunities that will be released along with Believe. The first is the 2021 COVID-19 Community Childcare Recovery Grant. This is a second version of a grant that was released last year, the Community Recovery Grant that community networks have had for the previous year. And then there's a new funding opportunity that we're calling Community Supply Building and Access Expansion Grant that I'll talk a little bit more about in a few slides. But in addition to those 2 funding opportunities for early childhood community networks, we also want to note that early childhood community networks should work in partnership with these other entities listed here. So school systems that have access to funds in the way of ESSER funds under these new stimulus packages, as well as childcare providers who will be eligible for some funding opportunities that they will apply directly for. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about these 2 specific funding opportunities for early childhood community networks. As I mentioned, the first one is a second round of the COVID-19 Community Recovery Grant. So all early childhood lead agencies are eligible and encouraged to apply for a second round of this grant to support activities aligned to the planning guidance released in Believe. And we've included some of those allowable uses as best practices for this grant on this slide. So things like providing financial supports to encourage and incentivize the early childhood workforce to return to work or stay at work in childcare. That could look like bonuses, incentive pay, stipends, grants to childcare centers, etc. Purchasing and distributing additional PPE and sanitation supplies as needed, providing ongoing direct financial support to providers for them to stay open or reopen, promoting enrollment through additional information campaigns or outreach to families. So, looking at that slide that we shared earlier that demonstrates the drop in enrollment for pre-K, that drop is also seen across childcare and Head Start. So this could be an opportunity for community networks to apply for funding to develop a more robust coordinated enrollment information campaign this year, supporting the quality of childcare centers through means such as professional development, coaching and training, observations, supporting families with continuous learning at home, purchasing and implementing curricula or programs focused on social emotional development and or trauma-informed instruction, and providing supports to families who are not currently enrolled in early childhood care to ensure that their children at home receive the supports and interactions and education that we know prepare them for school. So in the request for applications, we include suggested funding ranges. So depending on the size of the network, and we define size of network by the number of CCAP providers in the community network, we've included some suggested funding ranges over here to the right. I will note that community networks do not have to apply for a grant amount within their suggested funding range. So they can apply for an amount lower than their suggested range or higher than their suggested range. But we're asking that if you do apply for an amount that falls outside of the range, that you provide justification in your application. So the application process, the RFA will release today. The link is live. We encourage you to review the request for proposals. And I think Leslie will probably drop this link in the chat box. As you're thinking about whether or not you'll apply or how much funding you'll apply for, we encourage community networks to assess and communicate directly with providers to understand the needs of your community network. Make a funding request that's based both on the number of CCAP providers in your community and the demonstrated need. So you may find that certain childcare providers actually have a greater need than others that might justify a request outside of the suggested range. And this should really be done in partnership and in collaboration with your childcare providers and your program partners. You'll be asked to provide an estimated budget for the funding request, including anticipated uses of the funds, and demonstrate methods of community outreach that helped inform the funding request and your application. Here is the application timeline for this first grant award, and I will say both of these grant applications have the same timeline. We've tried to streamline the two applications so that communities that are applying for both, it's a very straightforward application process. So today, on March 30th, we'll release the Believe framework and the RFAs for both of these funding opportunities. On April 1st, the Word versions of these applications will be emailed to lead agency contacts. During the month of April, the department will use the April Early Childhood Lead Agency Collaboratives and lead agency office hours to provide additional guidance and answer questions. On April 28th, we're asking that lead agencies that intend to apply for either or both of these grant opportunities submit an intent to apply via Google form by 5 p.m. that day. That Google form should take you no more than just a few minutes to complete. It's extremely straightforward. And then on May 26th, so to give you almost a full additional month from the intent to apply, applicants will be required to submit their final application, also via Google form by 5 p.m. The week of May 30th, we plan to notify recipients of both of these grant opportunities. And then I've also included on this slide here just two opportunities or upcoming opportunities for childcare providers. As you're working on these applications, you may get questions from community or your program partners in your community network. So we want to make sure that you are aware of the timelines for funding opportunities for childcare providers as well. The first of which is the LCAP Childcare Relief Grant. So the first of these grants for 2021 will be released in April, and additional grant opportunities for childcare providers are anticipated to release in June, September, and December. On top of these LCAP Childcare Relief Grants, we anticipate at least 2 additional grant opportunities for childcare providers for Type 3 centers specifically related to teacher supports and accountability participation. And we anticipate that those grant opportunities will release in May of 2021. So now we'll talk a little bit about the second grant opportunity, which is the Community Childcare Supply Building and Access Expansion Grant. So this is a brand new funding opportunity that we're really excited to announce. We are releasing this new opportunity that is really focused on community network capacity building to develop supply of new childcare providers in an attempt to expand access. So we know that there are a couple constraints around expanding access to high quality early childhood. One of them is funding for seats. Another one is ensuring that those seats are high quality. But the third constraint that we don't often address meaningfully in Louisiana or across the nation is the fact that there's limited childcare infrastructure in this state. There are a number of parishes with no registered or licensed childcare providers and no providers that offer infant or toddler care. So we're opening up this funding opportunity for community networks to, through a phased approach, receive professional development and funding to expand their childcare supply in their community. So you see here the 3 phases that we anticipate for this grant. Phase 1 will really be a planning phase. So community networks that apply for this grant and are awarded this grant will conduct analysis on the needs of their community and where they have gaps in childcare supply and infrastructure. They'll do strategic planning and design. In phase 2, you'll actually move into the strategy implementation and thinking about sustainability planning. And then in phase 3, there will be conversations and support around long-term sustainability and evaluation of the strategy that was implemented. I see a question in the chat from Mary in Ascension about where the funding is coming from. All of the funding that we'll be talking about today is coming from the 2 recent federal stimulus packages. So for the early childhood grants, these will be through PERSA funds. Here's a little bit more about this phased approach for this new grant opportunity. So as I mentioned, phase 1 will really be a planning phase, and grantees, so successful community and networks who apply for this grant, will, during phase 1, develop a plan for how they intend to increase access to early childhood care and education in their community. And then they will receive $100,000 for project staffing, business supports, consultants, etc. And I will say that we anticipate that for some community networks, this grant will span multiple years. So if a community needs additional years to fully implement this grant, this first round of funding may be renewable for year 2 of the project. Phase 2 will be strategy implementation and sustainability planning. So moving beyond planning and into implementation, grantees will implement the strategies they developed in phase 1, and they will actually, in phase 1, apply for funding for phase 2 of this grant opportunity up to $500,000. And I will say that, you know, as we get into this work, we'll work really closely with early childhood community networks to understand what the specific needs are and what sort of problems they're trying to solve with this grant funding. Some community networks, it may just be a really small grant opportunity, and some may need considerably more funding. So we'll work with you to sort of determine your needs. And then phase 3 will be the long-term sustainability and evaluation of the strategy that was used. So grantees will submit a long-term sustainability plan inclusive of information related to scalability to meet additional community level gaps in access. So just thinking through what some of these access expansion strategies and childcare supply building strategies could look like. It could look like establishing partnerships with existing childcare providers to expand access. So you may find that there's insufficient supply of infant and toddler care in your community. You might work with existing childcare providers to set up additional classrooms or hire additional staff to create new infant toddler classrooms. This could be funding that would allow you to, you know, implement those partnerships and actually fund that work. Establishing new partnerships to leverage community-based facilities. So there might be facility issues in your community. You might not actually have any additional classrooms with existing partnerships. So you might look for new partnerships to leverage what facilities already exist in your community to expand childcare options. Maybe faith organizations that have space or unused space in schools that you might be able to partner with a childcare provider to operate a licensed classroom in. And so these are some of the strategies that we anticipate. I will say that applicants who apply for this grant and successfully are awarded this grant will also be given TA from national experts as well as department staff to really think through what is the best set of strategies for your particular community. And I'm going to share with you the timeline again. This is the exact same slide that you saw before, but again, just want to say that both of these 2 funding opportunities, so the Community Recovery Grant as well as the Child Care Supply Building and Access Expansion Grant, both will release today. We will send a follow-up email to all lead agencies on April 1st with the Word versions of the applications. We will have ongoing conversations about what these two funding opportunities look like, answer additional questions during the April collaboratives, office hours, and as a reminder, here are the deadlines for when you should submit both your intent to apply and your final application. Before I move on to the next section, are there any questions about either of these funding opportunities? If you have questions, if you could just type them in the chat, that would probably be best. And we're getting a little bit of background noise, so if you could mute yourself, that would be helpful as well. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Leslie, who's going to talk through the framework.
Hi everyone, my name is Leslie Doyle, and we are going to take a walk through our Believe framework. So the Believe document is divided into 4 different planning categories that include the most critical areas for supporting early childhood. So that includes childcare stabilization, expanding access, improving classroom quality, and family engagement and support for those learners that might have had disruptions in their learning this past year. So each planning category is then divided into prioritized activities, which are recommended to communities and may be supported through competitive funding. And then we also have our funding guidance that illustrates which federal stimulus funds may be eligible to fund each activity. And then we also are including within each column of our table resources that have been created to align to each prioritized activity within the framework table. And all resources can also be found within our Believe and Achieve library. Next. So our first category is to immediately stabilize childcare providers and the early childhood workforce. As you know, and as Taylor mentioned earlier, the impacts of COVID-19 have placed on the early childhood field have been significant, especially for our childcare sector. Without immediate stabilization, childcare providers are still at risk of closing their doors permanently, which would be devastating to children, to families, and into our entire community. So we want to make sure that our community networks understand the challenges that these providers are facing, the financial stress, the workforce turnover issues, and all the challenges related to health and safety that this pandemic have brought about. Once our networks understand and assess the needs of these sites, then they can develop a plan to support them. So our network should also be working to help coordinate vaccine distribution to ensure that childcare workers and support staff have access and information to vaccines if needed. They should be supporting providers to access business resources and any other programs offering financial assistance. And our networks need to support the childcare workforce and to make sure that lead agencies are on track to receiving that lead teachers are on track to receiving their early childhood ancillary certificate. And also, we'll be offering childcare teacher support grants that childcare providers are eligible to apply for. We know that recruiting and training a childcare workforce is a critical challenge, and childcare teachers often work for close to minimum wage and typically with no benefits. So we are really excited to be able to offer these teachers with the financial incentive for all of the hard work that they've been doing to support the children in their care. Next slide. Our second category is for communities to increase access to opportunities for high quality early childhood care and education this year. So many young children, especially our infants and toddlers, do not have access to high quality childcare in their communities. So this category is really focused on expanding that access and also building new childcare supply. Like Taylor had mentioned, some areas within the state don't have access to any publicly funded care. So for the first activity, community networks should consider how they partner with school systems to expand pre-K using ESSER funds or other local funding opportunities. Next, we want our networks to develop plans to build childcare supply in their communities, which might include adding new infant toddler classrooms in existing centers, partnering with family childcare providers, or establishing some innovative partnerships. So this will all be funded through a community level grant for early childhood lead agencies, with a targeted focus of building supply and expanding access. And those support documents are linked right there in the table underneath the resources. And finally, our community network should be looking for ways to secure sustainable local funding for birth to 3 seats offered in high quality, diverse delivery settings. Any Ready Start network that is awarded B to 3 seats this year will be required to develop a funding sustainability plan and will be given an opportunity to apply for additional Ready Start network allocations to support that work. Next slide. So the focus of this category, the third category, is to ensure that classrooms where children are enrolled next year are of the highest quality and that teachers are prepared to lead these classrooms and provide high quality interactions for all children every day. So community networks should ensure that all early childhood classrooms are utilizing the high quality curriculum and receiving professional development opportunities to support the effective implementation of the instructional tools available to them. So PD on curriculum, on assessment, on those high quality interactions that we score in class as well. So they can partner with their school systems to support this activity through their ESSER funding. We also want to make sure that our pre-K kiddos with disabilities are given the opportunity to participate in an inclusive classroom within the least restrictive environment. And in order for that to happen, we want to make sure that our teachers are trained to provide those children with the support they need to grow academically and socially within that environment alongside their typical peers. We've had a lot of success within the last year or so in partnering up our networks with the amazing vendors found in the Partnerships for Success Guide, and we're anxious about expanding upon this work. And finally, we want our communities to partner with our regional child care resource and referral agencies to understand the needs of our child care centers and to provide these centers with resources to enhance their indoor and outdoor learning environments, and to make sure that they have all the technology that they need to support the learning that goes on in the classroom. Next. And our last priority, or our last activity, is that we know that young children who have experienced disruptions in learning this year need to be given additional opportunities in order for them to be successful this upcoming school year. So children will be entering early childhood and early elementary settings at many different levels, coming from a variety of educational backgrounds. So to target children that may need the most support, we would like communities and school systems to identify children in need of intervention by conducting universal developmental screening of all children entering early childhood programs. So we have released several documents on what that would look like and have also begun training network leaders on a train the trainer model for scaling out the Ages and Stages Questionnaire, or ASQ, developmental screener. Our next, entering pre-K and kindergartners, is of course a major transition for young children. And because we had a lot of facility closures or family risk factors, many young children that would have typically been enrolled in high quality childcare, Head Start, or pre-K programs may have opted to stay home this past year. So I think we may be looking at a larger than normal cohort of children that will be experiencing in-person learning for the first time this upcoming school year. While children may be able to catch up academically, it'll be difficult to teach them the executive functioning and social skills that early learning programs reinforce in a play-based environment. So communities and school systems should be prepared to adequately address this group of learners. Some of the suggestions that we have within our guide and our resources are to enhance their current activities to transition children into pre-K and from pre-K to K, possibly by building out transition teams or hosting a transition summit, or even providing a Ready K or Ready Pre-K summer camp that gives kids a jump start into the upcoming school year. We also want to make sure that our communities and sites are supporting the social and emotional development of the children they serve, and they can be doing this by working with school systems to utilize ESSER funds or using any of the COVID community grants to support the childcare in their area. And finally, communities develop plans to enhance continuous learning through high quality interactions and developmentally appropriate learning activities for all children, regardless of their setting. We are providing guidance on what this will look like and showcasing what other networks around the state are doing relating to this activity. This guidance will be updated later this month or later in the month of April, so stay tuned for when those updates become available. Next. And finally, just to close this out, additional resources will be shared as well as other opportunities to collaborate with other early childhood network lead agencies during the upcoming spring collaboratives and also our lead agency weekly calls. So more information can be found during our lead agency office hours, those spring collaboratives in April. We've got the links for the Believe and Achieve library. Also, stay informed with our LDOE weekly newsletter as well as the early childhood newsletter, and then our system leaders monthly call. And if you have any questions regarding any of the information from this presentation, you can contact earlychildhood@la.gov. If there are any questions, you can type them into the chat box now and we can spend a little bit of time answering.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It looks like there are no questions right now in the chat box. As Leslie said, we know that this is a lot of information. So for our early childhood folks, we will be, having these conversations in greater detail on upcoming office hours and our spring collaboratives that will happen after spring break, after Easter on April 13th and 14th. So please stay tuned for all of those opportunities to learn more and discuss more. And if in between now and then any questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out to one of us on the early childhood team. And I think with that, we can pass it back over to Katie and Lexi and Danielle to move us into the Achieve portion of the agenda.